This is Where Did the Road Go? Our aim is to explore the fringe, to be true skeptics and question openly, to investigate the paranormal, bring light to the dark corners of history, and give a voice to the shunned of science. We deal in mystery and the important questions that these subjects bring to light. What is reality? Who are we? And why are we here? Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com for a full show archive, links to all our social media, upcoming schedule, and much, much more. Now, join your host Soraya on this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And tonight on the show, we are talking with Steph Young, and we're going to be talking a little bit about her new book, Hunted in the Woods, and had a lot of stuff I wanted to talk to her about. This book is a little longer than her other ones, and we got through less than half of it. So, I plan on having her back next week for part 2, but for now, we're going to get into this. She did record an extra Patreon segment, too, so if you're a patron of the show, you'll be getting that this week. And there is a midweek podcast coming up that's part 3 of the top stories of 2015. That will also be released this week. And, if you want to become a Patreon, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com, and it's right at the top there, above all the upcoming shows. All right, so here's my interview, part 1 of my interview with Steph Young, Hunted in the Woods. All right, welcome back to the show, Steph.
Hi, Soraya. Thank you for having me back.
All right, and your new book, this one seems a little bit longer than the previous ones. Am I wrong in that?
It is quite a bit longer, actually. Some of the stories are a lot longer. They took a long time to research, and what was strange was that it seemed to be starting out as a paranormal case or an alien-related case, and what was strange was that it was then going off into different directions. So the more I looked deeper into it, there were a lot of twists and turns leading to directions that I didn't expect them to go to, wasn't particularly wanting them to, but they did. So the stories seem to be quite a bit longer, and perhaps yes, it's quite a bit more extensive.
And this is, the main title here is Hunted in the Woods.
Yeah.
And then you have a nice long subtitle of sometimes predators are animals or human, and sometimes they are not.
Absolutely.
And when did this come out?
Back in November.
Okay. And, you have some really interesting stuff. I mean, you have interesting stuff in all your books, but this one had a lot of stuff I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, I think I put in the intro, it was about missing people and it was about non-human predators, but the twists and turns that it led me to were things like assassinations and patsies and really unusual things, as I said, which I didn't expect it to take me to, but it seemed that there was a lot more to these stories than you would initially have expected. And the theme kept recurring as well, so it's been very interesting to research it all, but it was not expected.
Yeah. I think, and the chapters are much longer for the most part as well. So,
yeah.
Go on.
Sorry. Well, I think in a way the books themselves are sort of turned into a series. So sometimes there's recurring themes. So I tend to sort of add a lot more to something that I might have mentioned in one of the previous books. Mm-hmm. So it's an ongoing work, really. I think it will just keep continuing because the answers are never going to be completely clear and there will always be more to look into. So
yes, we have mysteries abound, luckily, or life would be a lot less interesting.
It's fascinating.
Well, let's talk about one of the cases in the first chapter, and that's one that comes from the 1970s, and it connects to Andrew Collins, of all people.
Well, it does, and I have to say that because I'm quite new to this field, I've probably been only in it for about the last 4 years, and I didn't have much knowledge at all, I'm sad to say, about some of the leading people in it. So yes, Andrew Collins has been around for decades. Now, this story was initially called The Babes in the Wood, but that was a title that was unrelated to it when I first looked into it. There's a person called The Watcher, and he had begun to place lots of postings in 2008 on forums. And he had a couple of names. So one was Barry, one was Paul. But I did a lot of research into it. And it appears that he'd actually been featured in one of Andrew Collins's special reports back in 1978. And I put in the book that I hadn't been able to confirm that, but actually I met somebody just before Christmas who had a signed first edition copy of it with the report in it. So it took me a while to verify everything, but his story was also covered in a lot of correspondence that he sent to the Ministry of Defence, and they were then declassified, so put out into the public domain. And it started out as what would appear to be a case of alien abduction of 2 children and their subsequent deaths. But what it turned out in the end to be is probably something entirely different. And that's how it twisted and turned as I went along. So back in 1970, Paul, this man who calls himself the Watcher, he had been in a reservoir, which is quite rural, but it's actually close to streets as well. And it was 1970, and he was walking along after coming out of the pub with his friend, and he saw some strange lights above the King George Reservoir, which is in Waltham Forest, which is in Enfield, not far from London. And 2 years later, something was to happen there. But at the moment, he started writing his report saying that he'd been coming out of the pub and he'd noticed these strange lights above the reservoir. The report then goes on to say this was exactly the same place where 2 young children went missing, and searches were conducted exclusively in the area. But their bodies were then returned 3 months later, and they were found in a copse there. And he said at the time that they were found, there was a press blackout, and it was a real big mystery. And he said the families were told not to speak to anybody, and they were moved away. And the official word was that even though it was the summer, they died from exposure. So even though it was June and it was nowhere near cold, everybody was told they died from exposure. And he said that he went to the scene, and police were there in plain clothes, but the army were there too. And the public were being held back, and the army were carrying spades and taking earth away. And he said years later, the grass still won't grow there. And again, the official version was, well, they got lost and they died. But he said, well, that doesn't seem possible in summer. And also, it was only 500 meters from the nearest house in the street. And he said, well, I tried to get some information on this, and, you know, I was digging into it, and I had some unpleasant visits because a few nights later, there were 2 people sitting in a car outside my house, and that was a bit suspicious. And there began my run-ins with the men in black. And he said there were 2 different types, one of which were black-suited men, and the other were the non-human ones. And he said, you know, most people are going to mock me over this, but my interaction with these so-called men in black were that if you show them fear, they're going to be programmed to respond to you in a much more intimidating way. And I've learned that actually if you calm down, and it's easier than said than done, but if you calm down, they aren't programmed to do anything, and that will stop them. But anyway, going back to the story about the missing children, so he'd written persistent correspondence basically to the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, and looking at those files, although they're closed, the marking on it says that they're being kept for permanent retention. So I wanted to look into this a lot more. And the researcher himself, the Watcher, had been part of the West Country UFO Research Organisation. And it was actually from that organisation that he'd sent the correspondence in to the Ministry of Defence. So I could corroborate that. And he'd explained in his report that he'd seen initially at the reservoir 2 white horizontal objects attached to a cable, and they were going into the reservoir, and he was about 200 yards away from them. There was no noise, and he said that they descended and then went back up a little bit and were there for quite a long time, and there were other few people watching as well, and then they descended and finally went into a retaining bank. So then it's fast forward to 18 months later, and this is when the two children went missing. And he said they were found dead in a clump of trees just beside the reservoir. And it was strange because the police had gone all over with tracker dogs. And he said it's so strange that they should reappear exactly in the same place where they had went missing. And he said the trees above were burnt. So the local press printed that they died from burn marks and died from overexposure. Well, I couldn't find that bit in the newspapers, I have to say. But he says the bodies were not found close together. One of the girl's shoes was missing, and the other shoe she was wearing was completely clean. And he said if you drop two stones from the air, they're not going to land in the same place. And their bodies were not found together. He said UFOs have been known to leave burn marks, been known to kill animals, and the sun couldn't have caused those burns because we just don't have that kind of heat here. So he was saying in his report that he sent to the MOD, I feel that this was a UFO flap and things were going on there, and this is why they were killed. They were taken away and dumped back down again. But I looked into it because obviously I wanted to find out so much more about it. And the thing is, when I was looking into it, I found actually that they weren't. They were found. They were found close together, and it's very, very likely that they were the same children involved in something entirely different. Some of their clothing had been taken from the scene, but it appears that actually this was all possibly done by a different kind of predator entirely. And there was a man called Robert Jepson, and he was a convicted child killer. Now, 3 decades later, he went on to confess to having actually killed them. So there was a possibility, of course, that these could have been entirely different children, but we don't have that higher murder rate, fortunately, for that kind of thing. So it didn't seem like it. But anyway, if we put that aside for the moment, so I'll get into that again. This witness who corresponded said that he was then 2 years after this discovery of the children, he was driving past the area with a fellow UFO investigator. And they were talking about the case, and they decided to pull over and just have a look at the area and just sit down, have a cigarette. So it was early evening, it was still bright, and they looked over towards the copse where the children had been found, and they thought they could see something standing there. So they got the binoculars out, which they would have because they were investigators, so they had them ordinarily in the car. And when they looked across through the binoculars, they could both see on the tree line on the ridge about 400 yards away, they could see this figure that was standing completely still. It seemed to be of human height, but it looked like it was wearing a black gown which started at the neck and went all the way down to the floor. And it had long white blonde hair. But the most disturbing thing that they saw was that it had no facial features at all. So obviously they were really worried about that. And they looked around the area, and then they suddenly saw another figure. And it seemed to look like there was 2 identical figures. And they sort of both started talking to each other and saying, what the heck is it? It's really strange. And when they looked back again, the figures had gone. But what they saw instead was a little bit further along, they saw something really odd. They saw something running at a really fast pace, and it looked like a roughly human-shaped thing. That's how they described it. But again, it had no features at all. And there was another one, so there were 2 of them. And what they were doing were just simply darting around, really aimlessly, just rushing around. Now, they were really freaked out by this, so they just said, let's get out of here. So they drove away, went to another car park, and they thought, what on earth were we seeing? And after about an hour, they got the courage up to go back again. And when they were back the second time, what they said was that they could see a small red light, and it was hovering just above the trees, and it was slightly bigger than sort of a pea-sized shape through the binoculars. The next day, they went to their UFO Society's chairman and said to him about it, and they wrote up reports about it. And it turns out that at the time, there had been a couple of young girls not far from the area who they said they must have seen it, but of course they couldn't track those 2 girls down. And they said there was a man in the street not far away that they'd noticed, and he was standing outside of his house and he was watching what was going on. He was looking at the light. So they went and knocked on his door, and he answered it, and they said, could we use you as a witness? And he said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, you were watching the light and you must have seen those strange things running around. And he said, I was in my front room watching TV. What are you talking about? And so he just told them to get lost. Anyway, so the chairman of the society said, well, go to the site and see if you can find any kind of physical evidence that something was there. So they looked around, and in their opinion, they could find these broken off branches and things. So they thought, well, this is going to prove it, and they'd taken photographs. So they took it all to the chief, and actually they did have this report published in another journal called The Voice, and they sent it off to an American society as well, Ted Blocher, who was quite involved in that sort of thing, and he put it into a report. So basically it seemed like there was something going on there. But the thing is, and interesting, on a side note, this man who was the witness, the watcher, he seems to have had a very, very long history with this sort of thing. I mean, he's still around now, and he says that he was based as a security officer at a military base, and he talks about what he came across was a project which involved the development of artificial intelligence, and it was going to be capable of reading every single person's thoughts and emotions. Now, that sounds a little bit outlandish, but the reason that I thought it triggered something was that I don't know if people sort of followed the Jade Helm thing that happened back in June. Was it June to September in the States?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
And I was really, really interested in that because I thought, oh, what's going to go on? And I do remember listening to a podcast, and there was a lady on there, and she was going by the name of DJ, and she was calling herself a whistleblower. And she was saying that this Jade Helm was nothing to do with martial law. It was actually a artificial intelligence gathering operation, and that eventually what would happen would be that if there was martial law imposed, that the soldiers themselves would get their battle plans from this artificial intelligence, so that the generals and the captains and those in the army would not be making the decisions anymore. It would be made for them. They would be told who and where to go and round up. So I don't know, I thought that was quite interesting that he was thinking of that about 30 years ago and said that he'd come across it. So it's not something that we know we can corroborate, but it was just on a side note. Anyway, so going back to what he said he'd seen, and what he said was these two children found, from an alien abduction and deaths. Well, no reports were given in that report that he sent to the MOD, but when I was looking into it more, I did find that there were two children that were found after they went missing in that exact proximity. And it was 11-year-old Susan Blatchford and 12-year-old Gary Hanlon, and they were discovered in the corpse in March 1970. And the likelihood of it being a different pair of children is probably 0.001%, really. And the case actually in the newspapers at the time was called The Babes in the Wood, because obviously nobody was caught for it, and it was a terrible tragedy, and this killer didn't come forward for 30 years to say that he'd done it. Well, when I was looking into it, I thought, well, why did this investigator believe that it had been a UFO abduction? And I suppose, well, because he did believe that he'd seen these things going into the reservoir, and he had a strange sighting of these entities. So did he make a giant leap and assume that that's what had happened to the two children? It's entirely possible. Or on the other hand, did he have some kind of inside information? Well, I was erring on the side that he'd over-assumed it, really. But the official coroner's report that I found was that the children were lying next to each other, but the cause of death was unascertainable because of the degree of decomposition. They were found partially clothed, and the coroner went on to speculate that some of the clothing had been taken by the foxes. The police, on the other hand, were very much against that conclusion. At the time, they were saying this is clearly a homicide, because they said, look, some of the clothing that's been taken was underclothes, which to them pointed to it being a human predator. And quite interestingly, the lead detective on that was a man called Nipper Reed, and he was a legendary policeman because he had managed to put away the Cray twins. I don't know if you have heard of them in America, but they were East End gangsters. So anybody in the UK, they were the biggest gangsters basically, and he managed to put them away. So he's sort of more famous for that. But he was really saying, it's a clear murder and I need to investigate it. But he was not getting that from the coroner, and also, as I'll say in a minute, from higher up. The one thing I suppose you could say in the favour of the UFO investigators' belief is that, of course, the police, with their tracker dogs and their cadaver dogs, had been all over that area and had repeatedly searched, but they'd managed to pick up no scent. And the children lived a quarter of a mile from that site. On the other hand, though, the killer could quite easily have placed the bodies back there at a later stage, and that could have been why they didn't pick up on a scent. But the coroner kind of implied in the report that it was his belief that they'd been there for some time. So that perhaps is in the investigators' favour. But the policeman, Nipper Reed, would later make some comments about the case looking back on it, saying that many of the senior officials at Scotland Yard, which is the police HQ, were really coming down on him hard and telling him to stop investigating, and were insistent that this was just a tragic accident, that the children had become lost. So even though they were just a quarter of a mile from their home and over the age of 10, they would have known where their address was and where they lived. But he was being told they died of exposure, they became lost, leave it alone. And so I kind of thought, well, that's really weird that he was being told to not investigate it. But what I did find was some kind of strange twist. And for anybody that does go on to read the book, in the chapter beforehand, there's a case of another two children that were found in the woods and they'd been killed, and it's probably the most high profile case that we've had in the UK. And when that case came out, I don't think anybody would have thought for a second that the person who's in prison for it had not done it. It seemed to be blatantly obvious. But the very strange thing about that, and it was not what I wanted to find out, was that there's a very strong chance that this person was indeed framed for it for a very malevolent reason about what could be the cause of their deaths. So in that case, it really very much looked like there was something non-human that had actually done it. And he was probably used as some kind of patsy. I don't know. I don't want to say that that person's innocent because I think they're obviously a terrible person from their background, but it led me down some very strange paths. And so when I was looking into this one, I was very surprised with this case as well, that I came across a report in 2014 that had come out in the newspapers, and it was suggesting that the prisoner who confessed to the killing, who was already in prison because he'd killed a child, and that was not questioned. So he was in prison. But this newspaper report had an entirely different story, and it was saying that they had spoken to the prisoner's cellmate, and he was placed in the prison cell next door to this killer for a very specific reason. And he had said he was put there because he had been asked to try and extract information from this killer about something completely different. And the information that he claims he went on to extract, which he was asked to get, was about this man's involvement in a very bad child abuse ring, where this killer said that he had been employed as a chauffeur to drive children to some very dubious auctions in which they were, well, auctioned off for purposes in mansions in Surrey, in the Surrey countryside, which is quite a sort of posh area. And so the claim was that this man who killed the two children in the copse, and not the UFO, that he was employed as a chauffeur and he was carrying these children to houses where they were having these orgies. And this came out around the same time, and it's still going on, about in the UK, the question about high-level people being involved in some kind of child abuse scandal. Now, there is no complete concrete evidence of that, even though it's been investigated and all these claims keep being made. But I do have to say that it's not been proven, but some high-level names are being used all the time, said to have been involved in it, but it has not been proven. It's ongoing, and it's very, very hard to know. So there is no proof at the moment, and eventually something will come out to say whether it's true or not. But it's very interesting that what initially appeared to be an alien abduction quite possibly could be something else entirely. And yet, on the other hand, you can also say that I was thinking, well, if this child killer in prison could potentially be lying about his role as this chauffeur taking children to the parties where people from the establishment were using them, if he is potentially lying about that, then there's also the chance that he could be lying about being the child killer. So, in a way, it could then turn all the way back around to it being that, like the case that I kind of hinted on just now, the separate case of the other two children, it could turn out to be that actually he was in some way used as a patsy as well. It's all very, very strange, the way that these stories can kind of evolve. And as I say, I didn't imagine that any of that would be related to it, but it's very different perhaps to what initially seemed to be.
Yeah.
But that's not to detract from what he says he saw, going into the reservoir, and also these strange entities darting around. And as I say, this man has been, very vocal for the last 30 years and has never changed his stories. So it was very interesting to research it all, and I'm really not quite sure where the truth lies in that one, actually.
Yeah, it's very convoluted as it gets going.
It is, yeah.
So, let's move on to Black-Eyed Children. I actually cover this at the end of the same chapter. In 2014, you had an encounter with some black-eyed children in the woods.
Yeah.
Well, you didn't.
I
You
didn't.
had,
Thank the Lord. I was talking to Cliff, a man who runs a very good blog called Power Rational, and I wanted to ask him about a story that a writer had sent in to him. And I said, I really want to talk about this story. And he said, yeah, sure, go ahead, because it's absolutely compelling. Now, again, we have to say, well, is this true? I don't know. And I initially wanted to look into the black-eyed children because there had been quite a few sightings in a place called Cannock Chase, which is in the north of England. And I do not know about the witnesses in those ones. I kind of feel like, somebody is saying, well, perhaps the images they caught were photoshopped because they captured images. And so I thought, well, I'd like to really find something that I can really verify. Well, I think I maybe went on to do that in a little bit that we're going to talk about later. But this one is a very, very good story. So we'll just see. So he is called David, and he said, I'm a 26-year-old male. I work at a small private college in Michigan. I'm a regular guy. I like hockey. I like kayaking, hiking. Every year, I like to go camping. And before he starts his story, he said, I'm really open-minded, but I don't believe in ghosts, aliens, Bigfoot. I'm not even sure about God. And I feel like if I haven't encountered it myself, and I don't have evidence, then I'm pretty skeptical. He says, but now I'm different. So he decided to go camping where he likes to go, and he likes to go out of season. So it was late August 2010. And he set out for Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lake Shore, which is along Lake Michigan. And because it was late August, he knew that it would be fairly quiet. So he was really looking forward to just the solitude and getting away from everything. And when he arrived, he knew that he had to go to the ranger station and get his backcountry pass. And so he parked up and he headed into the ranger's station, but he realised he'd left his license plate number behind and he couldn't remember it. So he had to walk back out to the car. And as he went back out, he could see out of the corner of his eye that there was two kids standing just outside the station. And anyway, so he wrote down his license plate, went back into the ranger station, And he gave it to him. And then he thought, I'm going to use the bathroom while I'm here. It'll be my last chance. So he walked into the restroom and he went into the stall. And while he was in there, he thought he could hear whispering. And it sounded like children, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. So he carried on. And when he came out of the stall, he walked up to the sink and he could see the kids just standing there. He was washing his hands and he glanced up into the mirror. And then he looked and he realised that they were staring back at him, but they had completely black eyes and they had no white sclera at all. And at first he didn't do anything, he just sort of froze. And then when he turned around, I mean, his heart was pounding and he looked at the children, but they really looked like they were maybe about 12 years of age. And one of them went to take a step towards him and his fight or flight kind of kicked in. But he took a step back from them and he sort of edged towards the door. And one of them said to him, "Can you help us?" And he said, you know, despite my fear, the sheer decency of me wanted to help them, but I couldn't move and I couldn't say anything. And it just felt like I was standing there for an eternity. He said, and then he just managed to say no, and no, not right now. And he turned to go out of the bathroom and he said, in those few seconds that it took to go out of the door, I thought I was going to die. I thought they were going to rip me to shreds, and his knees were buckling. But he managed to walk back to the car, but he was too afraid to look behind him. And once he was back in the car, he took a chance and sort of glanced up, and he said they were just standing outside the ranger station staring at me again. And he was thinking, but I'm 6 foot, I'm quite a few pounds, I could take a couple of 12-year-olds in a fight. Not that I would fight them, but I could. And he's thinking, what's wrong with me? And he's saying, I've come across a grizzly bear in the forest before. Nothing has ever scared me as much as these two children. So anyway, he takes off and he drives off to the campsite that he's going to stay at. And he was really looking forward to it because it was going to be empty. But now his head's thinking, okay, I could make it back home in 4 hours. Why don't I just go home? But then he's thinking, no, I've come here, I've come all this way. And eventually he talks himself into staying. So he has two choices about how to get to the actual campground where he's going to put the tent. And he can either go through the woods or he can walk along the beach. The wooded trail is quicker and shorter. And the beach trail is much harder on the legs when he's carrying everything. But he wanted to go the beach route because he didn't want to go through the woods. So he reaches the campsite and his heart sinks because now he's got the seclusion he wanted, but he doesn't want it anymore. And he's thinking, oh no. So he thinks, okay, well, I've got a couple of hours until sundown. I'm going to get the wood. I'm going to get my tent up, cook my food. Everything will be fine. But as darkness is setting on the woods, his courage is going, and he reaches for the bottle of whiskey that he brought and pretty much just ends up drinking most of the bottle of whiskey that night. And anyway, he passes out, goes to sleep, and all is well. And he wakes up, and he is actually surprised that he's still alive. So it's still on his mind, but he thinks, oh, how foolish of me. Why was I feeling this dread about those kids? Anyway, so after breakfast, he hikes back along the beach to his car, and he thinks, I'm going to go on a dune climb, which is about a mile and a half. So he does that, he does the climb, comes back, and he thinks, right, I need to go into town, I need to do some shopping. And he's thinking to himself, why would I need to go into town? I came here for some tranquil. But anyway, he gets in the car and he goes into town, he spends all his time shopping, and the day passes, and he goes for dinner, and he has a steak. But then he realizes as he's coming out of the restaurant that he's done something really stupid and it's now pitch black. So he didn't get back to the campsite and he doesn't know why, he didn't think about it. And he thinks maybe I was trying to delay going back. But now he's got to go back in the dark and he's dreading it. And he thinks, well, I could just drive home, but I left several $100s worth of camping equipment. I don't want to leave it there. So he drives back, he gets his gear out of the car, which is a flashlight, and he's got a headlamp and he's got a walking stick and a pocket knife, and he thinks, okay, two options, go through the woods or go along the beach. And the storm clouds are gathering and it looks like it's going to pour with rain, and he thinks, well, I could go through the woods, but I don't want to. So he takes the beach path again, but when he has a mile and a half walk along the beach path, he then has a half a mile walk into the woods to actually reach the campsite and the tent. He sets off, and it's now dark, obviously, but he's got the headlamp, so he's got a bit of light. He's a little bit worried because he thinks, well, cougars and bears could be out, but then what's more worrying is that he's got this really dreadful creeping sense of paranoia, and as he walks along, the paranoia and the dread grows and grows and grows, and he finds himself stopping every few feet, maybe go 10 feet, and then he'll stop and look around, uses his headlight and see if he can find anything. And he even opens his jaw, because he said you can listen better if you open your jaw, you can hear better. So he's getting so paranoid, and he can't see anything, he can't hear anything. He walks another 10 feet and he stops looking around, and he says, I know somebody's watching me. And he said, I know that I can hear voices in the tall grass. Well, he'd been walking for about half an hour, and he knows any moment now he's going to come to the wooded part where he has to go. And he says, and then my world fell apart. My world fell apart. He said that the strongest moment of feeling like I was being watched, and he turns around in the direction that he came. Says he couldn't have been more than 5 feet away. The boy is standing there. He said it's the quiet boy. He's just standing there slightly a few feet away, and the other boy is standing next to him, just motionless, just staring at me. And he says, I'm not sure, I don't know how I could describe the terror. He said it feels like I was dying. The talkative boy, the one that spoke to him first in the bathroom, he says he moved toward me. I can see from the headlamp their eyes, and he's saying to me, help us. And he says, I can't speak, I can't move, I can't breathe. And the boy who was closer to him moves a step closer, and he starts to circle him. And then it's like it broke the spell. He says, I'm not helping you. And they say, we're lost. We can't find our campsite. And he says, is this a game? And they say, take us with you, please. We'll die out here. We're afraid. He says, the quiet boy moved a little more, and he's now standing right beside me. And the talkative boy is still in front of me, and they're blocking my way. And then things get even weirder. They say, okay, can you come with me? And he says, okay, can you come with me? And he says, I don't even remember thinking those words. Why would I say, can you come with me? And the talkative boy reaches out his hand to take him, and again he recoils and he starts to run. He just basically starts to run, and he runs through the woods, and he jumps off the trail, and he dives into the grass, and he just lays there for about 2 hours. And it's pouring with rain, but he can't move. He just hopes they're not going to find him. After about 2 hours, he decides he's got to get to the tent, because otherwise he's going to freeze to death. And he couldn't force himself to go back along the wooded trail, but he has to. So he finally gets back to his tent, and he's soaking wet, and he gets inside the sleeping bag. He's too scared to even change clothes, and every creak and every sound of the wind he thinks is something sinister, and he wants to fall asleep so badly, but he can't. And then he says, I thought it was a nightmare at first when I heard the voice. I thought I was dreaming, but then I realized it's still night and the storm's blowing, and I can hear this voice saying, help us. And he says, I couldn't help it. I screamed. I was completely helpless. I screamed. And they're saying, please let us in. He's saying, no, no, no. They're saying, it's so cold, let us in. He's saying, I can't let you in. And he's just repeating this mantra, no, no, and screaming and screaming and screaming. And this probably, I presume, goes on for hours. Finally, he wakes up and it's morning, and he has lived through the night. And he packs his stuff up as fast as he can possibly move, and he's pretty much running around. And as he walks back, or rather walks rather fast back through the woods, he comes across a duck with the heart torn out of it. And he rushes as fast as he can. He gets into his car and he drives away, and he says, I've never been back since. I've never been camping. I don't know whether they're demons, monsters. I don't know what they are, but... So, that's just...
Did you say duck or dog?
A duck.
Okay.
Yeah, with its heart torn out. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a creepy Men in Black encounter. I think it's probably the creepiest one I've ever heard.
It's really, really creepy. I mean, he's described it very well. As I say, who knows?
Yeah, and it does seem like they're there just to create fear for whatever reason.
I just don't know. They seem to, from how he was describing it, and the fact that he was sort of saying, yes, come back with me. It seems that they have some kind of hypnotic power, and because he was saying, I was lying in the tent and I was saying no out loud so that I couldn't hear them because they were hypnotizing me. Yeah.
All right, we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Steph Young.
Where Did the Road Go can be heard first and usually live on WVBR, Saturday nights at 11 p.m. Eastern. Go to wheredidtheroadgo.com to ask questions of our live guests through the chat room. Where Did the Road Go is then re-aired on Dark Matter Radio and Deprogrammed Radio. You can download all shows for free on the website, and you can subscribe to us on Stitcher, iTunes, YouTube, or Vimeo. Additional content can be found on our video channels. You will also find our upcoming schedule, book reviews, blogs, free book downloads, links, and more. We are also on Facebook and Twitter, and if you want to help support the show, there are links to donate to us. Everything you need can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com.
All right, and we're talking tonight with Steph Young about her new book, which is Hunted in the Woods?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't have it right in front of me there. So let's continue on the black-eyed children sort of path here. And you have an old artist, actually, who drew pictures of people with utterly black eyes.
Yeah. This is all very strange. As I say, I was really trying to find something a little bit out of the normal in terms of the black-eyed children encounters stories. And I was drawn to this because I don't even know how I found it, but there's a very unwatched series of videos, and they're done by a man called Dante Sartori. Now, they're very artistic in the way they're done, and they're very, very long, and they're very arty, and actually it was really frustrating to watch it because it took hours to watch all the way through to try and get to what he was actually telling me, but I had to endeavour because I could tell it was something a little bit different. Now, this man himself is called Dante Sartori, and he appears to have done probably about 15 years worth of research into an artist called Modigliani. And Modigliani he's probably one of the most famous artists, and if you were to look at his paintings, you would recognize them in an instant. One of his paintings in November last year was sold for $170 million, and it was the second most expensive year. Now, his paintings are very, very easily recognizable because he paints the eyes with no sclera. Sometimes they're white, sometimes they're blue, but a lot of the paintings are very, very haunting, and you could almost say look sinister because the eyes are completely black. So, and when you look at it, you think that the claim this man's making, you think, well, that's pretty obvious, but you'd never think it in the first place. And there are other interpretations of why he painted the eyes black. So let's just say I'm not saying exactly that this is the reason, but I did do several months worth of research trying to get to the bottom of it. So it began from this man who had done these videos, and he said that he was pointing out, like I just said, that a lot of these paintings had these jet black eyes with no other colour in them. So, for example, there's one called Bust of a Young Woman who has the deep black eyes, and there's a painting called Anna Zabrowska. They're all figure paintings, so they're of people, and again, had the blackest of eyes in them. And then there's another one of a husband and wife that he painted, again, exactly the same. So why would he do that? Well, he used to say, when I know your soul, I'll paint your eyes. This is what the artist used to say. So you could say, well, that's why he did it. But Dante Sartori looked into the diary that was allegedly written by his mother, Eugene Garcin. Now, she began keeping a diary back in 1886 when the artist was just 2 years old. And I was looking at the evidence about that, but also about his life as well. And in fact, his daughter wrote a biography about him and said, "We do know very little about him during this time period. It seems to be shrouded in mystery and intrigue." But in the diary, she allegedly, and I say allegedly because I spent months and months, and I was corresponding with Dante and I was trying to get it, but I cannot get hold of this diary. So anyway, I'll sort of flesh it out a bit more later. But in the diary, so he is supposed to have been featured in this, and the mother writes that Isaac, who is the artist's grandfather, is getting too attached to Amadeo, the little boy, taking him everywhere, taking him to the temple, but not our temple. So Dante was putting all these extracts out, saying about these entries, and I was looking into it, and I was thinking, well, what is the temple? And the temple, it turns out, is probably a Masonic lodge, because it seems that his grandfather was also a Mason, 33rd degree, but also quite possibly, and we can't prove this, but quite possibly could have been involved in the Illuminati. Now, in Livorno, where he was born and grew up, there are 18 lodges there, Masonic, out of a total of 34, which seems disproportionately high. So there seems to be quite an important activity for that, but it doesn't mean necessarily to imply anything sinister. Anyway, so now the story of Dante, the researcher, is interesting itself because he spent a lot of time in the library in Marseille in the south of France, where this diary was supposed to be, but it wasn't there all the time. And he'd been translating it, but it was interspersed with trips abroad because he said that he was in the special forces and was away in the Gulf War and other conflicts. So he would go away, come back and continue with his research. And he was absolutely obsessed with this. Now, during the 1980s, this was when he was looking into it. And he'd been trying to track this diary down with private collectors, but nobody would let him have any information. But then he went and he started to live in Marseille, and it was purely sort of coincidental, but he was in a bar one night, and it was a bar that he used to go to every night to have a beer in. And he got talking to this guy, and he was saying to him, I'm obsessed with this, I'm trying to track all this down. And they just got talking. And he said, well, I think I can help you here. And he made a phone call, and this mob guy turns up. And the mob guy says to him, my boss has the paperwork, he has that diary. I'll talk to him and see what he says. And a few days later, the mob guy goes back to the bar and meets him again and says, well, he did have it, but he's given it to the library. So Dante goes to the library, and that's where he begins to do the research. And he gets more and more translated. But in the meantime, he gets called away to go and fight again in the wars. And then he comes back. When he comes back, it's gone. It turns out that the mob guy, the leader, the head of it, apparently, had taken it back and was keeping it at his house, but said to him, you can come anytime you want to do your research. So anyway, so he lets him go. He goes to the mafia guy's house all the time, does the research. So in the diary, in 1889, he's called Amadei, Amadei, who is his uncle, and Isaac, who is his grandfather. His mother has written about the uncle and the father, saying that they want Modigliani to be one of them. They want him to be the new face of the movement. And so Dante Sartori is saying, well, this is clearly, they're talking about the Illuminati. They always put artists and musicians at the forefront so that they can influence generations. So they want to indoctrinate him into that. And that was what his mother was concerned about. And then there's more entries. So in August 1889, it says, I know that I must take Amadeo out of here because they want him even more. They want him closer even more, and they're furious about it. And then a couple of months later, she writes, I must take him out of Livorno because I don't want him to become like them with their soulless eyes. I've seen them, they're close, and my son is going to paint them. So I thought, well, who's the soulless eyes? Is she talking about her father, the alleged sort of Masonic person, and the Illuminati ties? Is she saying that they're the ones with the soulless eyes, or is she talking about something else? Anyway, the mother is so concerned that she does indeed take her son away. She takes him to Tuscany and Florence. She takes him on a tour of Italy, really. And we have a couple of silent years, so we don't know what's going on. There's no more entries. But at the same time, there seemed to be a UFO phenomenon going on in northern Italy, in the Tuscany region. It was called the Lights of Berberiro, and lights were being seen all the time. And in the diary, there's also reference to that. So she's saying the lights of Berberio seem to follow us everywhere we go. So that's a bit strange. She's saying that these lights are following them. She's writing next, we're in Florence and the lights are there. What could they be? Plenty of people are talking about them, but Amadeo seems amused by them. And then it seems to get worse in the diary, and she says, we're in Rome. Amadeo is increasingly interested in these lights, and last night I found him walking around the garden and I swear I could hear him laughing. And then the next entry is, we're in Venice. I know what I'm seeing. I've seen them. I'm not going mad. They're here, and I'm sure that he speaks to them at night. And then again, she says, I sat outside his room all night, and before sunrise, I heard a voice saying, paint us, paint us. And Amadeo is just a tiny boy at this age. He hasn't started painting. But Dante Sartori, the researcher, was saying that at the same time, there were lots of strange abductions going on, aimed mostly at boys and girls. So people seemed to be going missing. Children were disappearing. In the diary again, it's still 1901, and she's saying, but much more fatalistically and ominously, she's saying, oh, I must return home now. I know that they are part of his life, maybe even more than myself, and those deep black eyes, dark like the night, and they are so young, they're his age. So I don't know, it seems to be that she's saying he's seeing something and he's replying to them and talking to them. And that was the researchers, Dante's impression was, that these black-eyed kids basically were somehow stalking him and following him around, and it was somehow related to these lights and these other abductions going on. But then we also have the link about the Masonic and the Illuminati sort of influences. So I wanted to take a look at other research really and see what I could find out about his life. And there is a couple of years where nothing is written about, but there does seem to be that in his older life, he was very much entrenched and possibly influenced by a lot of occult and esoteric things as well. So although a lot of the art critics have said, well, he was influenced by the African masks. That's how his sort of empty eyes are coming from these African masks. So that's where he gets it from. But a lot of people were also sort of writing, that they seemed a bit strange. And he was surrounded by a lot of occult people at the time. His childhood was really unorthodox, I suppose, because his grandfather Isaac had these possible Illuminati collections, but he also came from a long line of Jewish scholars, and they'd actually had quite an in-depth knowledge of the ancient texts and magical practices that were in these texts. His aunt as well was described as living in a very mystical household. And when he was a boy, he actually painted. He was 12 years old and he painted some skulls on a bookcase. And he stood there and he explained how he'd done it and why. And he said that the woman's skull was a symbol of love and its destructive power. And the man's was the patriarch. And he said, this is a male succubus and this is what he always is often being. And I thought, well, that's really quite a profound thing for a 12-year-old to be talking about, and then in some of his letters in latent life, he'd written and he'd said things like, I'm the prey of great powers that surge forth and then disintegrate. Well, you could say actually that's his artistic leaning. That's the artist in him. It's nothing to do with the supernatural. But anyway, so as a child, he grew up in quite bad poverty. But the family used to say that we were the bankers to the Pope. And his daughter says, well, they used to say that all the time. I think they were more like money lenders, really. So they lent money to cardinals. So there's a possible sort of tie-in there with the Pope and things like that. But the family were Sephardic Jews. And the daughter says that she was brought up very much in the Talmudic learning. Now, the daughter went to live with the aunt because when Modigliani died, his mistress, the mother, threw herself out of the window and onto the floor and died. And that was the day after he died. So she was an orphan. So she grew up, she said, in a household that really practiced all of these Talmudic studying. And his grandfather set up a school for sacred Talmudic studies. Well, I'm not an expert in all of this, and it really did take me a long time to sort of, read into it. But the Talmud is supposed to be normally alluding to the Babylonian Talmud, and within these texts is supposed to be sources of very high magic. And although it was forbidden at the time to practice magic and witchcraft within the Babylonian Talmud, it really does allude to a lot of magical workings. And in fact, it was forbidden to be practiced, but because it was so widely used, supposedly, it was deemed necessary that people like judges and lawmakers had to have a working knowledge of this magic so that they could understand that it was being used. And it was so ingrained that actually the quote that I found really fascinating was from a book that was written about it in the 1925, I think. And they were saying that actually the scholars of the time were so adept within this magic that they would use white magic to counteract the black. So it seems to have been that it was being used, apparently. And they said, well, the scholars were so good at it that they could consume men with a glance or reduce them to a heap of bones, which is fascinating. Anyway, so it seems that the grandfather that came to live with Modigliani, who was getting too close to him and wanting him to go to the temple and wouldn't leave his side, was from that line of the family. So there's a suggestion there, perhaps, that he had these influences as a child, regardless of whether he had these black-eyed kids encounters. In some of the biographies, it mentions that some of the people that he drew, perhaps he got the inspiration from them and drew them because of that. But that doesn't really sort of make sense. But what was interesting is that a few art critics have pointed out to him leaving Illuminati clues within his paintings or in the notes that he left beside the paintings. And he once left a poem saying about the snake slithering out of its skin and delivering you, and talking about equilibrium from three aspects. And so we don't know, nobody really knows what that meant, whether it was the stages of the Illuminati or Talmudic or a spirit body soul connection. But the patron who supported him as an adult, he was quite struck by the ties to alchemy and the esoteric. And he wasn't interested in that himself, but he did seem to think that Modigliani was interested in mystical correspondences and in searching within alchemy. So that was his impression. And then his son, who was an ecclesiastical historian, so the son of the patron, also seemed to say that he leaves motives, Illuminati motives, and there is some kind of tie in here. He's obviously searching within the esoteric and he's searching within alchemy. He also had one of his lovers, for example, Beatrice Hastings, and she was into theosophy. So he had people around him that were heavily into alchemical symbols and putting them into the drawings. And he was associated with another occultist and an astrologer called Conrad Moricand, and he did several drawings of him, and it was with those that he seemed to leave this motive being a recurring symbol, that he put those in the paintings. So I was looking to sort of find out whether there was something within his background himself or who he associated with, to try and explain why he might have been a little bit, stranger than most artists in the presentation of these dark eyes. There's even a painting that at the moment is unattributed to him, so it could not be his, quite possibly. But one researcher has gone further and says that actually you can see in this painting, you can see the skulls, the demons, the horses, and all of those sorts of things. And these are clearly codes. That's what he was saying. Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. But I suppose we have to go back to the mother saying that she could that she could hear these voices, saying, paint us, I know that they're part of his life now, these deep black eyes, and they're so young, like he. And So,
I wish we could confirm the actual
well,
diary there.
yeah, I know. I really have gone. I've tried. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's taken me months and months, but the thing is, I kept it in there because I, did a lot of work around his life as well. Now, I'm not saying that any of this means that he was as entrenched as it might suggest. It could all just be reading too much into it. But it is interesting that his
Yeah.
life, he seemed to be surrounded by people who are very, very interested in these kinds of things. Um, but another possible sort of strange thing I thought was the fact that people used to write about how he could recite Dante's Divine Comedy. I mean, of course, that's always been said that there's the three parts of it, which are the Illuminati columns. So again,
Right.
like with Leonardo da Vinci, there's this suggestion that they were into these secret societies and they were leaving codes throughout history. Well, it's possible. And again, these things take so long to research, and I'm not an expert in any of these fields. So you really need experts in each individual thing to sort of
Yeah.
take the rein, and. But so I have to stop. At some point, I have to stop and say, I can't spend a year looking into this. I have to stop because there are so many other things that I'm putting into the book. But what I did find interesting was the fact that he could recite the Divine Comedy. Well, I find that astonishing that anybody could do that. It's clearly not a good, it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
And he wasn't,
Yeah.
so for a boy to do that. But I found another person, and it relates to what this researcher who says about the diary was talking about people going missing. And there was, and this has been verified quite well actually, the one about the Pansini boys. Now, they were a couple of boys who were around at the same time as him. And sort of how I found that was because there was another boy at the same time who was reciting the Divine Comedy at a very young age. But this boy had never been taught Latin, which is what it was in, and he'd never been taught the Divine Comedy, and he was very young. So it led me into that, and it was in Italy, and it tied in with the fact that he was saying, with the UFO flap going on, and people, especially children, were going missing. Well, these two boys, they were called the Pansini family, and they lived in another village in Italy, and it seemed to begin when the parents, perhaps unwisely, took the boys to a seance. And when they got back, a few days later, one of the boys, Alfred, he started talking in a language that they'd never heard before. It's like he went into a trance and then he would start talking, and they thought, well, it sounds like Greek or Latin. And he then used to start reciting the Divine Comedy. And they couldn't understand it because they had never taught it, and there's no way he could have known it. And very strange things started going on. There was furniture being moved around, and he was going into trances, and he was speaking in an adult voice and a very deep voice, and it was not his voice. And they were so worried that they actually asked if he could go and live at a monastery and be tutored there instead, which he did. But when he was there, whenever somebody went to ask a question, he actually answered the question before they'd asked it. And but even more astonishing is that the religious tutors there then took him again to another séance. And I don't know why they would do that, but so they took him to a séance, and when he was there, the board, the planchette, spelled out that you must use a triangle of wood because they were using some paper. And they looked around and they said, well, we don't have a triangle of wood. And the little boy said, yes, you do. It's in the kitchen. It's in the saucepan. And they went into the kitchen, and this triangle of wood, which was brand new and it was perfectly constructed, and it was sitting on the stove in a saucepan. And they said, well, how did you know that? And they checked with the parents, and the little boy had never been to this carpenter's shop, which was in a different village, and he certainly hadn't made it, and he'd never been to that house before. So all these strange things were happening. But in this case, it was actually recorded by the physician to the Pope at the time, and Charles Fort later wrote about it, but also a criminologist called Lombroso Cesare wrote about it, and the Occult Review and the Annals of Psychical Science, they all took the case up eventually. because nobody could understand how this could be at all possible. And the school returned him to live with his family. They sort of didn't want any more to do with him. But glasses were being thrown around and the furniture was still moving. So a local priest was called in to do an exorcism. But while he was there, it just seemed to antagonize whatever was happening and make it worse. And the holy water was thrown around. And the priest left, feeling helpless, really, and the phenomenon just continued. And the boy continued to speak in a voice that was not his. And one night he told them that the voice had been sent from God to drive out the dark forces in the little boy. And then after that, sweets and chocolate were being left around the house. And one night he woke up and he said that a terrible battle is taking place between good and evil. And then he went back to sleep again. And it was all it was really strange. But then it got even more strange because one day the boy was found with his brother at the site of a convent in another town, and it was 9:30 in the morning. Well, they'd been at home at 9 in the morning, and the town was more than 30 miles away. So it's impossible. They didn't have a car. Nobody took them. And then a few days later, the family were having lunch. It was about 12:30, and the father realised he hadn't got the wine on the table, so he asked the older brother to go and get it, and the older brother didn't return. So he asked Alfred to go and look for him. At 1 o'clock, the two boys were found on a boat in the sea, in a port in a neighbouring village, and the fishermen suddenly turned around and saw these two boys there, and the boys started to cry, and they were so confused, and it took them 2.5 hours to get back by coach to their house. So the parents were thinking, this is ridiculous. And a medical doctor called Franz Hartmann, he was also a keen scholar of the occult, and he took an interest in it and examined them. And all of the scientists got involved, and the doctors and the priests, and nobody could understand it. And there's a researcher called Aaron Dabber who is very, very good, and I found something he'd written about a theory that somebody had come up with, and it was called ambulatory automatism, which means that at the time the newspapers were reporting that the only possible explanation is either that it's unexplainable or that they had this ambulatory automatism, which is a tendency to run as fast as you can. So you just have to run. But it just wasn't possible because they were so far away. They were like 30 miles away within,
Right.
they just could not have got there in that time. It was just impossible. And the criminologist, Cesare Lambruso, he interviewed all the witnesses, everybody involved, and he could find no logical explanation at all. So they never got to the bottom of it, and it stopped, as these things often do, exactly when they hit puberty, and it never happened again. And you could say, well, this all happened a long time ago, it can't be true, but you just kind of wonder how everybody could have been fooled in that case then, because scientists and doctors and priests and the Pope's doctor, so it doesn't sound like it was some kind of hoax, because when they went missing, there was never anybody along the route or the road that ever saw them. So it wasn't, and they couldn't have run 30 miles in 5 minutes, or half an hour. They just couldn't have done it. So,
That sounds like a modern debunker explanation. Let's just throw it out there. It sounds better than saying we don't know.
Yeah, they ran.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's get through another one or two here before we run out of time. How about Mr. Stephen Mortimer Beckwith? He had a rather strange sighting.
Yeah, that was really strange because, again, I kind of found this one because in the Modigliani thing, the paintings had really long necks and they were really pale and white. And anyway, this story, when I was looking, came up, and this was told by a vicar to a field group. So they had a kind of walking group, and it was read out at the time, but it was also then put into a book, and the book was called Law of Prosperine, and it was written by Maurice Hewlett, and it goes back to the 1887 era. So this man, Stephen, he was a clerk at a bank. He was married with one child, and he'd been to stay at his friend's. And he was on his way home, and it was dark at night. He was on his bicycle, and he had his dog Strap with him. And he made the point of saying in his account that although it was dark, it was quite a full moon. And he even saw an owl flying, and he could see the sheep on the hillside. So he had a good view. He could see the stones in the road. Anyway, his dog suddenly darted up a embankment and ran up the hill. And he was calling to Strap, saying, "Come on, come back, come back." And the dog just wouldn't take any notice. And it had its pointer up, like, it was ready to pounce, but it wouldn't pounce. So the man got off his bicycle and he went up the hill and he said, "Come on," and he couldn't get Strap to come away. He couldn't get the dog to move. And the dog was really shaking, and it was like he was really scared, but he was transfixed at the same time. And then really, the dog just started howling, like howling at the moon, really. And so the man was standing there and he's thinking, well, there's obviously something in here. It might be a trapped rabbit that I could help, or it might be a man that's drunk, and so I need to help them. But he couldn't really see inside the bush at all. But he just thought, okay, I'm going to put my hands in and I can see what I can find. And as he was doing that, he could see these two eyes staring back at him. And he pulled out what was in there, and it seemed to be a tiny girl. And she seemed to be about 3 foot. But she had this very, very pale, waxy skin, and she was absolutely tiny. So her neck was about the size of his wrist. And he tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't reply. It was like she didn't understand him. And he thought, well, this is really queer. And so he picked her up and he carried her down. He was about to carry her down the hill when he saw a light, and it turned out it was the local policeman. And the policeman was coming up the hill because he could see him, and he was wondering what the man was doing. So Stephen said to the policeman, with this girl in his arms, "Oh, well, I think there's been a bit of foul play here because she's been dumped in a bush." And the policeman was saying, "Well, yeah, there might be some foul play, but, get on home now, it's late and dark." And the man's thinking, well, why are you not noticing that I'm carrying this person? And the policeman goes away laughing. So he thinks, well, that's really strange. I thought he would have helped me anyway. So he puts the girl on the handlebars and cycles back home. And when he gets back home, his wife, she's standing at the door saying, "You're so late. I was really worried about you." And he says, well, this happened. So Strap ran up the hill and he was barking and he was howling, and he starts to tell her, and his wife, as she's listening, she leans on his bicycle, so she puts her arm on the handlebars, and it's gone straight through the girl. And he just thinks, how could that happen? And so obviously his wife can't see this girl. So he can't understand why he can see this tiny girl with really strange eyes, and she seems to be wearing clothes that are made like they're from cobwebs. But he can't understand it because his wife can't see, so he thinks, well, I can't tell her. She'll think I've gone balmy. So I'm just going to put her in the dog kennel. And that sounds really cruel, but actually, he's got 2 dogs. So Strap, the little dog, went indoors, and he's got a greyhound as well. So the greyhound sleeps in the kennel outside, and he's got the house bit of the kennel, but he also had a tarpaulin, the canvas. So he'd made a really big run inside a big garden. So there was really lots of room for the dog to run. So he puts the little girl thing that he found, he puts it in the dog kennel. And then the next morning he goes out, she's still there. And he thinks, well, this is very, very odd. But it gets worse than that, because his daughter, who's 4 years old, also starts playing with the girl, with this discovered girl. So he can see her, and the daughter can see her, but the wife can't. Now, all of this was written in the book, but it was actually written as a factual story. That's the really strange thing about it. It was written, and it came out in the newspapers, because he was writing it as a form of confession, because he was saying, if only I had told my wife that I had brought her home, if only, and this is all my fault, I blame myself entirely, and this is the result. And of course, you don't know the result until the end, but he'd told the police, he'd made a full confession about what had happened, and it had got into the newspapers. And in fact, the police kind of believed him. Well, what actually did happen was that he kept her there for several months, and the little child, his daughter, would play. They'd run off together and play, and he thought, well, that's fine, they're just having fun. But one day, he was watching them, and the little girl that he discovered had been making a crown for his daughter, a crown of reeds, sort of making it into a head garment. And he thought, oh, that's so sweet. But he went to work, and when he came home, he found out that his daughter had disappeared. and she was gone. And they did a massive search. Obviously, they covered every part of the county, every hedgerow, every hill, and they never ever found her. They never found her, nor this mysterious creature or girl or whatever she was. And he said, looking back, I know that she was obviously bewitching my daughter and took her away. But the fascinating thing about it is, of course, in that case, is that it's supposed to be true. Well, I don't know. Is it folklore or is it true? Well, it seemed to be that people were saying it was true, and it's very, very strange because it was an invisible creature that only some people could see.
It's definitely creepy, if nothing else.
Yeah.
And if it was meant as a fictional tale, it seems to be kind of ahead of its time.
Exactly. And I mean, it doesn't seem to be fictional, but it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be that it went in the papers, it was investigated. Because obviously, when I was reading it and I got to the end and I thought, oh, well, clearly he abducted his own daughter and killed her. I thought, that's what you would say if you were a policeman. Of course, you'd say that he invented this. He invented this fictitious person.
Right.
But he made a confession. He openly went to the police and said this. They had every opportunity to say, you killed her. But it turns out they didn't say that to him. They said, it's a tragic story. So, yeah. But
it's a different time, too. I mean, it was the 1800s, so...
So, yeah, I suppose they didn't have the fingerprinting DNA or anything like that, did they? So, yes, you're right. How could they fully...
But it still seems like kind of a fantastic story to come up to explain that to shift the blame of your crime.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It seems like you could just say she ran away.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, the way it's written incredibly well. I mean, I've given a very, very condensed version, but the actual story goes on for months and months and months, and it's page after page that he's written, which you would think that's a lot of effort to go to, but I don't know. We don't know the answer to these things.
That is true, and we are just about out of time for this week. We're going to have you back to cover some of the other stories. But the new book is Hunted in the Woods. Sometimes predators are animal or human, and sometimes they are not.
Yeah.
And we barely scratched the surface.
I know.
So we'll have you back, and we'll cover some more of these.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
All right, so that was part 1 of the interview with Steph Young. Part 2 will hopefully be next week. And we're going to do maybe a roundtable with her as well. There might actually be a third part that ends up as a midweek podcast dealing with something, one specific part of the book. We'll see how everything goes. And that's the plan. All right. If you want to become a patron of the show, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. It's only $3 a month, and I'm trying to get more and more stuff for everyone. I try every time I talk to someone to get a little extra segment, 5 or 10 minutes of them talking about something different.